When a hit is sanctioned by the boss of a mafia family, the chances of survival are slimmer than hitting the lottery. Depending on the hitman hired, the target could die a slow and painful death, or be blown into pieces all over the streets. Let's cut into 5 of the most horrific homicides committed by mafia families in the United States, starting with Frank DeCicco, a man who rose to become underboss of the Gambino crime family before his premature demise. Bursting into the world on November 5, 1935, young Frank DeCicco was literally born into the Mafia. His dad, Vincent "Boozy" DeCicco, was a soldier in the Gambino crime family known for his excessive drinking. Not only did the Mafia genes get passed to Frank, but his brother and sister, George and Betty, also worked for the Gambino family. His childhood was relatively quiet for the son of a soldier in the mob, but his adult life is filled with stories of underworld activities that would give the most hardened criminals pause. Frank DeCicco, aka Frankie D and Frankie Cheech, entered the Gambino family in the late 1960s as a soldier who most described as sloppy or messy. He was well known for his disheveled appearance and dirty, clutter-filled 1985 Buick Electra sedan. However, many mobsters, including Sammy the Bull and Paul Castellano, were extremely fond of the enforcer and praised his abilities often. Frankie D started his criminal career alongside Anthony "Gaspipe" Casso, an up-and-coming gangster who would later become underboss of the Lucchese crime family. The 2 new members were tasked with diamond store heists and hijacking commercial trucks for the load they were carrying all throughout New York. The duo was so impressive that Paul Castellano took notice of Frankie Cheech and brought him under his wing as his protege. From there, Frank catapulted to the top ranks, gaining respect and power along his path and attracting several other talented family members. Among his newly formed crew were some of the heaviest hitters in the Gambino family: Joseph the German Watts, bodyguard for John Gotti, as well as Joseph Old Man Peruta. Impressed further with his fortitude and ability to lead, Castellano placed Frank in the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, or IBT. DeCicco was dedicated to the Union Local 282, running the labor racketeering numbers in that department, where they used their muscle to extort money from the members to ensure they could continue working. But his talents surpassed the number running and robbery world. Frank DeCicco was also extremely successful in homicide. During a disrespectful time in 1978, one Gambino associate, Nicholas Schibetta, an addict whose vices included alcohol and cocaine, made several insults about the daughter of George DeCicco and publicly embarrassed the family by becoming embroiled in brawls. Castellano asked Frank to handle Schibetta, but made sure to inform Sammy the Bull, his brother-in-law, about the hit first, out of respect. Initially, Sammy was enraged and vowed to kill Castellano first for his treachery, but after Frankie D discussed the details further, Sammy calmed down and accepted Schibetta's fate. DeCicco descended upon Schibetta quickly, and he was dead shortly after. Again, in 1983, Castellano requested another retaliation against Gambino soldier Roy DeMeo. Understanding DeMeo's reputation and reverence in the underworld, DeCicco decided to approach the assassination in a different light. With most of the mobsters in the city worried about being disappeared by the DeMeo crew, DeCicco directed 2 of his own squad members to take out their leader, with promises of promotions within the Gambino family for the favor. The 2 men reluctantly accepted. A couple of weeks later, DeMeo was found in his own trunk with multiple gunshots to his body and head. But the underworld isn't without its own sense of irony. Just 2 years later, Castellano would be on the receiving end of assassination orders. Due to his obstinance about trafficking narcotics and greed in garnishing all family profits for himself, John Gotti decided to make a move for control. With the help of 2 other family members, Joseph Joe Piney Armone and Frankie Locke Locascio, they plotted the murder of Paul Castellano and his recently promoted underboss, Thomas Bilotti. Fortunately, there had been a conflict between families that needed resolution, and DeCicco had the perfect plan to make amends. After days of pleading with Castellano, he finally agreed to meet with Armand, the son of Agnello della Croce, a mobster who had recently passed. When Castellano refused to show up at his wake, the rest of the family took the utmost umbrage at the act and demanded the respect Della Croce had earned. To lay the beast to bed, DeCicco had set up a meeting between Castellano and Armand at Sparks Steakhouse in Manhattan, New York. The trap was set. On December 16, 1985, Castellano and underboss Bilotti arrived at the restaurant and parked their car just down the street. As the two men exited the vehicle, several men ambushed them and opened fire, cutting them down in a hail of bullets in the middle of the road. Days later, Gotti declared himself the new head of the Gambino family, with DeCicco as his underboss. Coincidentally, Sammy the Bull had passed the idea of DeCicco running the family, with Gotti being his underboss. But Frank knew Gotti would never be pleased in second place. The two men conspired to allow Gotti 1 year to run the family, and if it didn't work, then they would take command and run the family right. However, Frank DeCicco would never see the end of that 1 year timeline. After being promoted to underboss, DeCicco was handed control over all of Castellano's white-collar crimes he had in the books. These new ventures distracted Frankie D and prevented him from keeping his ear to the ground for counterattacks. With the recent slaying of Castellano, many members of the other families were displeased about the unsanctioned hit and demanded reprisal. On April 13, 1986, DeCicco and Gotti were scheduled to attend a meeting with longtime friend of Castellano, James Failla. Failla relayed the rendezvous details to Victor Amuso and Anthony Casso, two members of the Lucchese family who were instructed to avenge the murder of Castellano. As DeCicco approached the Dyker Heights Brooklyn meeting place in his 1985 Buick Park Avenue, Amuso and Casso sat patiently awaiting. When the assassins noticed both men had arrived for the meeting, they detonated the bomb. The explosion was devastating. The blast not only destroyed the car and the two men in it, but several buildings and other vehicles in the vicinity. The hit was designed to appear like it came from the Zips, a Sicilian mob calling card. Frank DeCicco was killed instantly. However, the other man in the car was not John Gotti, but another associate that the hitmen misidentified as Gotti. Gotti swore revenge for the murder of his underboss once his trial was completed, but no retaliations were ever confirmed. Years later, Casso became an FBI informant and revealed all of the plots to the Bureau.
Ready for a healthier life? Contact Pure Home 365. Our water and air purification systems are the only products that remove up to 99.9% of all contaminants and toxins that we breathe and drink. So call 904-386-3816 or scan the QR code to schedule your free consultation with one of our experts. We'll discuss the details about the contaminants in your water like lead, chlorine, and even arsenic. Then provide you with a curated solution based on your family's needs to give you the cleanest cooking, bathing, and drinking water throughout your home. So call Pure Home 365 at 904-386-3816 or scan the QR code for your free consultation. Our friendly and knowledgeable staff awaits. Pure Home 365, helping people live longer, healthier lives.
Betrayal is a hard pill to swallow for anyone. But in the Mafia, where criminal activities are the lifeblood of the family, it can be extremely more devastating than a broken relationship, especially when the person betrayed knows where the bodies are buried. Let's call Wilfred Willie Boy Johnson to the stand for this sensational story of a man who wanted to be made more than anything, but ultimately was cast aside and killed for his actions against the family. Born and raised in Canarsie, Brooklyn, a suburb of New York City, Wilfred Johnson began his journey on September 29, 1935. Willie Boy was one of 5 children brought up in the Red Hook borough by his Italian-American mother and Native American father. Johnson's rap sheet started early in life at the age of 9. It said that his rebellious nature was due to his dad's abuse. He was well known for blowing his entire paycheck on booze and beating his wife and kids during his rum-filled rampages. Willie Boy's first offence was obtained when he attempted to steal money from the cash register at Helen's Candy Store, a regular hangout of infamous Murder Inc. members. It was a downhill spiral from there. At 12, Johnson got into a fight on the school rooftop, where he fell to the ground and suffered massive head trauma that would cause incessant headaches for the rest of his life, leading to several incidents of outrage. With his reputation for fighting and his stocky physique, the 5'9", 200-pound icebox was recruited as a Mafia enforcer. In 1949, he already amassed a crew of henchmen in East New York who collected Mafia debts that were owed to the mob. Several years later, Willie Boy met with high school dropout John Gotti. Recognizing the muscle Johnson provided, Gotti brought him along when he joined the Gambino family and put him in charge of a local gambling racket so Johnson could support his family. Willie Boy jumped at the opportunity, taking on any and every task possible in an effort to ingratiate himself with the rest of the family members. Most of the Gambino family enjoyed Johnson's company, but looked down on him as a gopher, someone who would do anything he was told just to get a smile or praise. As hard as he tried, Willie Boy Johnson would never become a made man in the Mafia due to his father's inadequate bloodline. However, that didn't deter Willie Boy. He was loyal and committed to the family, willing to tackle any task provided in hopes that he would be elevated in the family at some point. But as time wore on, his position in the eyes of up-and-coming superstar John Gotti would play a pivotal role. In 1966, all of that changed. Willie Boy Johnson was arrested and convicted of armed robbery. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison. Believing in the rules of the Mafia, Johnson felt all right about doing his bid. His direct caponegro, Carmine Fatico, ensured him that his wife and 2 infant children would be well cared for during his time behind bars. But that was quickly countermanded, leaving his wife to enroll in welfare to support the kids. After decades of dedication and commitment to completing any and all operations he was given, Willie Boy Johnson had enough. In a decision of reprisal against the family, Johnson turned informant to the FBI. His knowledge of the family business and close ties to rising mobster John Gotti made him an ideal informant who was nicknamed Wahoo as his undercover identity within the Bureau. Although Johnson never volunteered info against the Gambino family, he was always extremely direct with any questions they asked. But the Bureau asked plenty. Over the subsequent years, several arrests were made thanks to Johnson's information. The FBI busted a few gambling operations and racketeering rings, even capturing Paul Vario's hijacking headquarters. Eventually, he turned on the man who brought him into the family. In May of 1973, John Gotti, Angelo Ruggiero, and Ralph Gallione were all involved in a conspiracy to commit murder. The 3 men plotted against and executed James McBratney at a bar located in Staten Island, New York. A waitress at the bar was able to identify Gallione and Ruggiero, but failed to provide an accurate description of the third assassin. Shortly after the homicide, Gotti was said to be bragging about the incident, which Johnson later reported to his handler. Instead of moving on the info, the FBI passed the paperwork onto the local police department. Gotti's paid policeman in the department alerted him of the imminent arrest, and Gotti fled, going into hiding. It would take an entire year, but the law caught up to Gotti, and he was finally taken down. But after weeks of debate and negotiations, Gotti pleaded guilty to manslaughter instead of first-degree murder, and got a reduced sentence. After the case was closed, his attorneys received the documents from the prosecution. In these papers was the confidential informant whose testimony landed Gotti in prison. Listed under the legal documents was none other than Wilfred Willie Boy Johnson, aka Wahoo, for the FBI. Coincidentally, Johnson was arrested and convicted on another robbery charge and served time in the same penitentiary as John Gotti. The two conversed often in the pen, and Gotti told Johnson that though he would never be allowed back in the family, but he, his wife, and his children would all be safe. Fearing a trap, Johnson made Gotti swear on his dead son's grave. Gotti swore, Johnson believed him. In 1988, Gotti greenlit Johnson, assigned the task to a former Bonanno family member, Eddie Lino, known for his involvement in the Castellano killing. Gotti wanted to ensure that the hit wasn't traced back to him and that it would be executed with perfection. Gotti was concerned that if the assassination failed, Johnson would flee into witness protection and provide even more info on the family. Collaborating with his cousin, Lino sublet the contract to him to raise his status. His cousin in turn passed the contract to 3 other members of the Bonanno family. Finally, on August 29th that year, Wilfred Johnson left his house for the last time. As he approached his car in the street, the 3 gunmen rolled up and opened fire, unleashing 19 shots at the unsuspecting target. Several shots connected with his torso and limbs, but more than 5 penetrated his head. The culprits peeled off, leaving a trail of jack-like spikes in the road to prevent a chase. His wife heard the shots and ran outside, falling to her knees and cradling his bullet-riddled body in the middle of the road. Wilfred "Willie Boy" Johnson died immediately. 4 years later, Bonanno crime family Caponegro, Thomas "Tommy" Karate Pitera, and Vincent Kojak Giattino were arrested and put on trial for the murder. Giattino was found guilty and imprisoned for life. Pitera was surprisingly acquitted, but would subsequently be convicted of several other murders a few years later.
Crossing the Mafia is an act that most criminals and cops wouldn't even dream of. But for one man with a passion for justice and a desire to be a detective, claiming his time in the spotlight for his takedown of a notorious mobster irrevocably transformed his life. Welcome to the world of Arnold Schuster, an everyday Joe who became the face of an upstanding citizen that ultimately led to his untimely demise. Born on February 21, 1928, Arnold L. Schuster was an average American with high hopes of becoming famous one day. His childhood was relatively quiet. He kept his head in the books, learning everything he could about writing. His cousin, N.C.M. Lincoln, Max Schuster, was a famed literary agent and book publisher for the company, Simon & Schuster. With the right connections in his back pocket, he set out to become a national best-selling author. However, fate often throws curveballs and sends us down a different path. Along his journey, Arnold became fascinated by criminal stories and fancied himself an amateur detective. Using his skills of observation and keen intellect, he was constantly reading news reports about unsolved crimes committed in his city, Brooklyn, New York. And during that time, unsolved crimes were a dime a dozen. Writing a bestseller proved more difficult than Arnold imagined, and he was forced into a regular job, working as a salesman for a local clothing store. However, on one fateful day during his subway ride to work, his inner Sherlock Holmes awoke. For years, Arnold Schuster had been deeply intrigued by spy and detective novels, often reading about local and national crimes, as well as having a fondness for Dick Tracy stories. Living in the Big Apple, he was consistently captivated by the criminal underworld that surrounded the city. With a daily dose of crimes being committed in his area, Schuster kept a vigilant eye open for any illegal activities in hopes of becoming famous and using his tale to write the next great novel. On February 18, 1953, his dreams came true. While riding the subway to his job, he noticed a man just a few seats down from him that looked suspiciously familiar. As he approached his stop, he decided to stay on board the subway car and see where his potential perpetrator exited. Several stops later, his suspect stood up and moved to the doors. Schuster furtively followed. After several blocks of trailing his target, he witnessed him descend into a garage. Acting quickly, Arnold darted to the nearest payphone and dialed 911. He made his report to the dispatcher, claiming he just saw one of America's most wanted walking the streets of New York City without a care in the world. When the police arrived, they were bewildered how a man known for deceit and disguises was so easily recognized and tailed. They quickly apprehended the culprit and made a huge public display regarding their heroic arrest of Willie the actor Sutton. This once-renowned gangster had been on the run from the law for almost a decade before this chance encounter led to his downfall. Nicknamed the Actor for his ability to transform into anyone needed to complete a job, Willie Sutton was infamous for carrying out many bank robberies in his criminal career. Even more incredible, after being arrested and imprisoned multiple times, he managed to escape not once but 2 times from different prisons. During a renovation of the Philadelphia County Prison on February 10, 1947, Sutton and several other inmates dressed up as guards and used the confusion of the passing crews to carry ladders and other construction equipment out of the compound completely unnoticed. Even as the prisoner searchlights spotted him climbing the ladder over the wall, Sutton yelled, "It's all right!" None of the other guards persisted further, and he escaped into the night. Just a few years later, Willie Sutton landed on the FBI's most wanted list, ranking number 11 in the country. But even with massive media coverage and nationwide news reporting his escape and the ongoing searches, he remained elusive, apparently bragging to his underworld buddies about his dark deeds. In a book he later released, Sutton claimed to have stolen upwards of $2 million in his illustrious bank robbery career. After years of hiding in plain sight, Willie the actor Sutton was finally captured in the New York City garage after being followed by the amateur detective Arnold Schuster. However, when the police slapped on the handcuffs and walked him into the precinct, all the credit went their way. Boasting and bragging on camera, the department took full ownership of the bust, never once mentioning the assistance of a local citizen. Outraged and wanting his claim to fame, Arnold Schuster hired an attorney and filed a lawsuit against the police department. The pending litigations launched Schuster into the spotlight. He was broadcast all across the country in several news reports. He was even brought on for a live interview with the New York police commissioner to address his role in the capture of the longtime escapee. But as the saying goes, be careful what you wish for. Arnold Schuster finally got his time in the limelight, parading himself all around town as a good citizen who caught one of America's most wanted criminals. But his 15 minutes of fame was cut short. Less than a month after Sutton's capture, Schuster was leaving his Brooklyn apartment for another potential rendezvous for an interview. As he exited the building, a man emerged from the shadows and approached him in the street. As he closed in, the stranger revealed a .38 caliber revolver and pumped 4 rounds into Schuster's head and chest. Arnold Schuster died on the spot. A citywide manhunt ensued immediately, with all of the police force targeting Sutton's associates. However, after months of investigations and interrogations of well-known gangsters, including many mobsters of the Gambino crime family, no arrests were ever made. Though it's speculated that someone from the family was responsible for Schuster's death, the murder remains unsolved. Arnold Schuster's life was cut tragically short. He was just 24 years old when he met his untimely end, a young man with a promising future ahead of him. His story, however, is not just one of loss, but also of remarkable bravery and an unwavering commitment to justice. But his story, a poignant blend of courage and tragedy, continues to resonate. In the vibrant streets of 1950s New York, Arnold was just another face in the crowd, yet his actions would soon set him apart. He was a man who believed in the power of doing what was right, no matter the cost. He was an ordinary man who dared to dream of extraordinary things. His memory serves as a call to action, urging us all to be brave in the face of adversity and to never shy away from doing what is right, no matter the cost.
Most mentors become overwhelmingly excited when their protege overtakes them. But in the underworld, when the boss's apprentice becomes more powerful, it never ends well for the master who elevated the student. Meet Frankie Yale, the Italian-American mobster who assisted the rise of one of the most notorious gangsters in our history, only to be dethroned by the same man when his greed took control. Francesco Aiuele was born into this world on January 22, 1893, in Longobucco, Italy. When he was just 7 years old, he, his 3 siblings and his parents immigrated to America and settled in New York City. By the time he was a teenager, Francesco was already running with the local 5 Points gang thanks to his new friend, John Torrio. The 5 Points gang proliferated in prostitution and gambling throughout the Manhattan district and made Francesco an enforcer, even though he was average height and a bit hefty. Surprisingly, he was a talented street fighter as well as a thief. As his reputation began growing in the streets, he Americanized his name and became Frank Yale. His mentor and friend, Torrio, ended up moving out west to the Windy City, leaving Frank as a lead man. Newly unveiled, Yale became a common name in the underworld and with the police. At 17, he was brawling in pool halls, getting arrested for assault after breaking pool cues and slinging billiard balls at several men. Just 2 years later, Frank was picked up on a homicide charge, but it was later dropped due to lack of evidence. But just like his mentor, Frank stayed focused on business over ego and immersed himself in the racketeering game around town. He cornered the ice delivery business and extorted each one for protection. Eventually, Frank used some of the profits from the racket hustle to open the Harvard Inn Bar, an establishment on Seaside Walk in Coney Island, where he hoped to make a killing off the collegiate name. It was at this joint where Yale hired a bouncer by the name of Al Capone, a youngster with ambitions of making it big in the Mafia. Recognizing his potential, Yale took Capone under his wing and showed him the ropes of how to be a gangster. For 2 years he worked and learned under Frank Yale, taking his beatings along the way. During a night when Frank Galluccio was a Patreon, partying with his family and friends, Capone made a comment about his sister. Galluccio was not pleased. He snapped out his switchblade and sliced Capone 3 times, leaving the infamous scars across his face. Shortly after the incident, Capone was sent on a collection that turned homicide. When a witness stated seeing a man with severe scars on his face, Yale sent Capone west to Chicago to continue his tutelage under Torrio. As Frank Yale's burgeoning empire progressed, others started to take notice. Whether it was the Irish-run White Hand Gang controlling the docks, or the Italian Mafia families angered by his presence in their territories, Yale was constantly battling with rivals as he reached for the top. It wasn't long before they started taking shots at him. On February 6, 1921, Frank and a few friends were on the way to a banquet when they were attacked. Several men ambushed them and began firing. Yale's bodyguard was killed in the assault. Frank wasn't fatally wounded, but did take one in the lung, which required several months of treatment before being properly healed. Another hit was launched just 5 months later against his brother Angelo, believed to be retaliation for the murder of Ernesto Melchiorre, a mobster from the Manhattan district. Then in July of 1923, when Frank and his family were leaving a christening at his church, he decided he would stroll back home and let his chauffeur, Frank Fort, drive his family to the house. When they pulled into the driveway, 4 men rushed to the vehicle and opened fire, assuming it was Yale. Fort was killed instantly. His family was unharmed. Unscathed and more determined than ever, Frank Yale persisted in his quest for power. His reach had expanded greatly, and fewer rivals were daring to challenge his rule. Towards the end of 1924, Frank went out west to help his old friends, Torrio and Capone. However, his visit was for business, not pleasure. While in town, they stopped by a local flower shop and surprised the North Side gang leader, Dean O'Banion. The 3 gangsters unleashed a wave of bullets, killing him instantly. As he was attempting to return home, Yale was arrested and interrogated about the murder. With no physical evidence and an airtight alibi, he was released later that day. Riding high and feeling invincible, by the middle of the Roaring Twenties, he was considered one of the most powerful and feared men in the Big Apple. His hands were in every underworld hustle, from gambling to union labor racketeering, even dabbling in the murder-for-hire industry from time to time. However, his Canadian whiskey imports would be the business that bottled him up in the end. His longtime friend and protege, Al Capone, was expanding his own operations in Chicago and came to Yale for assistance in his bootlegging business. Believing that his mentor had his best intentions, Capone agreed to buy from Yale, and the two started a lucrative transportation chain of the brown booze. But it wasn't long before Capone noticed his shipments coming up light, or not at all. During several of his shipments, his trucks were hijacked and his drivers were killed. Even after switching the routes, his truck still got hit. Capone decided to send his own man, James Filzi D'Amato, to keep an eye on the operations and report back what he found. As Capone suspected, his old friend was the culprit behind the raids on his bootleg runs. D'Amato quickly realized that his cover was blown and decided to take action. On July 1st, 1927, D'Amato took a few shots at Yale, but missed his chance and fled. Just a few days later, Filzi D'Amato was gunned down in the streets of Brooklyn. It would take almost a year because of issues with rival gangs in Chicago, but Capone would get his revenge. On July 1, 1928, Yale received a distressing and cryptic phone call that his wife and daughter were in trouble and needed help. Refusing his chauffeur's help, Yale hopped into his coffee-colored, armor-plated Lincoln and peeled off into the streets. Patiently waiting just a few blocks down was a car filled with 4 men, carrying shotguns and automatic weapons. When Yale approached, they launched out into the road and began the chase. The 2 cars tore through the streets, creating chaos and destruction along the way. After several blocks of ramming and battering each other, the attacking vehicle overtook Yale. Knowing about his automobile upgrades, the men all aimed through windows, blasting 3 shots to the left side of his head, killing him immediately as he swerved off the road and crashed. This was the first time in history that an automatic weapon was used in a gangland assassination. All 4 men escaped and no arrests were ever made. Having a moniker in the Mafia is a rite of passage. The nicknames are generally passed on to new members based on a specific look or skill that person possesses. And when you're widely regarded as a feared enforcer who enjoys using Tommy guns to murder and maim, the title Machine Gun makes perfect sense. Let's unload the drum of details about the highly renowned mobster Machine Gun Jack. Entering the world on July 2nd, 1902, young Vincenzo Antonio Gibaldi started his journey in Licata, Sicily. At just 4 years old, he and his mother moved to America to unite with his father and other family members. Vincenzo arrived on Ellis Island in 1906 and was raised in the Red Hook, Brooklyn district of New York. Unlike most mobsters, he was brought up in a good family, staying out of trouble and excelling in sports as a kid. He was particularly fond of boxing and chose to pursue it professionally. At the ripe age of 14, he traveled west to the Windy City, where he changed his name and adopted the nickname Battling Jack McGurn. This Irish-sounding alias made getting into fights much easier and more profitable for the up-and-coming boxing star. However, as Jack ascended the realm of the ring, tragedy struck back home. Jack's father died. This untimely loss was a major setback for Jack, but he persisted still. After his dad's death, Battling Jack and his mother returned to Chicago to continue his professional boxing career. Shortly after his father's passing, his mother remarried a local grocer, Angelo D'Amore. Meanwhile, Jack pushed for excellence and maintained a strict workout regimen, propelling him to a top-tier boxer by his graduation. The world was just within Jack's reach, but terror struck again, and his stepfather, Angelo, was murdered in the summer of 1923. The shock stunned Jack. He took a break from boxing for the funeral, but life would never be the same. After burying Angelo, Jack McGurn turned to a dark side that he didn't know existed. He hit the streets for information and discovered that the Jenner gang, a local family that ran Chicago's Little Italy, attempted to extort his stepdad, demanding money for protection. It's unclear if Angelo refused or just couldn't pay, but the gang got their way. A few years later, in 1926, Jack managed to track down all three men involved. In the span of 8 days, McGurn murdered the three Jenner gangsters who killed Angelo D'Amore. Just the beginning of his journey performing diabolical deeds. His retaliation roared through the streets of Chicago, launching him into infamy among the underworld. He was recruited by the North Side Gang at the start of 1926, but when his talents were noticed by Al Capone, his loyalty transferred quickly, and Machine Gun Jack was born. Jack exploded onto the scene, blasting his way to the top as Capone's most prolific hitman. His first major murders were the West Side O'Donnell crew members, James J. Doherty and Thomas Red Duffy. Marking his staple early, Jack drove beside the car and unloaded an entire drum from his Tommy gun into the sedan, killing everyone inside. However, unbeknownst to Jack, the Assistant State's Attorney, William H. McSwiggan, was one of the passengers who was also killed during the shooting. Slugs would later be linked to Jack's machine gun, but he never faced any charges. Later that same year, McGurn made his biggest move to solidify his moniker, gunning down the rival leader of the North Side Gang, Earl Jaime Weiss. Jack positioned himself across the street from the Holy Name Cathedral and let loose a wave of mayhem from his trademark Thompson machine gun, cutting Weiss down in the street. Perhaps the most infamous murder case where Machine Gun Jack was said to be involved was the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Although he and Capone were nowhere near the city when the multiple murders occurred, it's widely believed that McGurn was the mastermind behind the massacre and advised his mentor, Al Capone, to take a leave of absence down in sunny Florida during the shootings. Machine Gun Jack became a household name throughout the Mafia families. His murderous tendencies and flashy attire made him a highly valued target. However, Al Capone decided that McGurn should be made and elevated him to a Caponegro with the Chicago outfit. Machine Gun Jack, now a made man in the Mafia, was untouchable. He flourished in his new role, partnering with several local businesses, including a speakeasy jazz club and the infamous Green Mill Gardens, an entertainment lounge that boasted many performers back in the day. But that didn't stop Jack McGurn from maintaining his regular operations. When lounge manager Danny Cohen asked Jack to dissuade the talent, Joe E. Lewis, from transferring his act elsewhere, he was more than happy to oblige. He politely approached the entertainer and advised him that it would be wise to continue his performance where he already was, or else face the consequences. Lewis wasn't intimidated and took his show on the road. Keeping true to his word, Jack attacked Lewis in his dressing room, slitting his throat from ear to ear and cutting out a chunk of his tongue. Miraculously, Lewis survived the assault and made a full recovery. Although he could never sing the same, he persisted in his passion and resumed his career several years later. By the beginning of 1930, the chairman of the Chicago Crime Commission, Frank J. Lush, created a list of the most wanted men in Chicago who he saw as the most corrupt influences in the city. Falling in at number 4 on this list was none other than Machine Gun Jack. Even though this publicity may have inflated McGurn's ego, it absolutely deflated his position of power in the family. Displeased with the unwanted attention, the outfit practically exiled McGurn, turning their back and unsanctioning any actions he took. Down but not out, the talented Jack McGurn turned to his athletic abilities once more, taking to the golf course. He was well known to be an excellent golfer and after several months qualified for a shot at the Pro Tour. But his past stayed on his heels. On the day of his tournament, several undercover officers approached Jack on the 7th hole of the course, demanding his arrest. He begged to finish the game, but was too flustered by the police presence and failed to qualify. A few years later, after Capone's removal from the outfit, Jack was completely ousted by the family and banned from any illegal activities. In regular fashion, he refused to accept his fate and decided to make a few deals on the side anyhow. In a show of strength, the Mafia responded in kind. On February 15, 1936, Machine Gun Jack was busy shooting down pins at the Avenue Recreation bowling alley when 3 men entered and attacked him, firing a barrage of bullets at the unarmed bowler. Not missing a chance for humour, the unknown assailants left a Valentine's card next to his body that read, "You've lost your job, you've lost your dough, your jewels and cars and handsome houses, but things could still be worse, you know. At least you haven't lost your trousers." Jack's half-brother, Anthony DeMori, vowed vengeance against Jack's assassins. He threatened to hunt down and murder the men responsible, similar to how Jack avenged Anthony's father. However, several days after the public announcement of revenge, Anthony was gunned down in a local pool hall. Those culprits were never caught either.